thank you for having me here. It's really exciting to be back virtually. And you'll notice I use some Tufts colors here for my opening slide, showing my Tufts pride. So yeah, I'll be talking today about novel analytical approaches in guiding big cat conservation and management. And my talk clocks in around 38 minutes or so, just so you know. And this talk is dedicated to all Indigenous peoples whose knowledge is so critical to the preservation of our natural systems and to the conservation of threatened species. So this work as well was part of my dissertation work at SUNY ESF. I also have affiliations with Panthera, with Wild Crew, which is at Oxford University, and now I'm at the University of Washington. All right, so I had to throw this one in because I am a proud Tufts alum, graduating in 2006, as Colin said, and here is my photographic evidence. So my focus today will be on the use of traditional ecological knowledge in the quantitative toolkit for big cat conservation. So what exactly is TEK? It's knowledge that's specific to a location. It includes the relationships between plants, animals, natural phenomena, landscapes, timing of events that are used for lifeways, such as hunting, fishing, trapping, agriculture, and forestry. And yeah, it's passed down over hundreds of thousands of years through direct contact with the environment. And it's really about the relationship of living beings, human and non-human, with one another and with the environment. So today I am privileged to be taking you to the jaguars of Central America. We'll head over to a large mammal community in the largest contiguous protected area complex in any single African country, which happens to be in Angola, which surprises people, and to the lions of Hwange National Park, Zimbabwe. And this is a photo of Cecil, the famous lion killed by a bow hunter in 2015, who is one of the lions collared in the study that I was privileged to be associated with. So my roadmap for today's talk will focus on 3 topics, and each of these, conveniently, was a chapter of my dissertation. So it's essentially the integration of that traditional ecological knowledge in assessing single and multi-species occurrence, in guiding conservation and anti-poaching strategy, and in the mitigation of human-carnivore conflict. And this was me performing interviews in a village in Mozambique to assess lion presence in an area that was pretty much unknown as to whether lions were there. So question 1, can interviews with local residents serve as a reliable means of assessing jaguar presence outside protected areas in Central America? If you want the full publication, feel free to check it out in the Journal of Applied Ecology. So jaguars are the largest cat of the Americas. They're near threatened on the red list, and they range from northern Mexico to northern Argentina, though of course there are some that get across the border into the southwest of the US. And the range-wide conservation strategy for jaguars is this Jaguar Corridor Initiative. So it's spearheaded by Panthera, but it's in partnership with other government entities and nonprofits. And in this Jaguar Corridor Initiative, we have these JCUs, which are Jaguar Conservation Units, that are the jaguar strongholds connected by a series of corridors. So the JCUs, the strongholds, are in the dark green and the corridors are in the light green. And about 50% of that area is protected, and those JCUs and corridors encompass about 62% of jaguar current range. So about 10 years ago, we knew jaguars were in the JCUs, those dark green strongholds, but what about corridors, and how do we do this across such a large area? Now, if you work for a nonprofit doing international conservation, you'll think, oh, just set up some camera traps and see if there are jaguars there. However, this was a really unique situation in which there were a lot of this area comprised communities and privately held lands, and camera trapping would just be really tough across such large areas and in privately held areas. And you would need a lot of cameras, a lot of money, and you would also risk camera trap theft if you're not navigating those land tenure relationships easily. So we decided to go with interviews with local residents within the jaguar corridors. This had been done before, but certainly not at this scale and with the analytical framework that we employed. So I personally covered the jaguar corridors of Belize. So Belize just has an incredible wealth of ethnic diversity. There's a population of 360,000, which is quite small, but there are Mestizo people, there are Creole people, there are Maya. So the man on the left here is a Quechua Maya. There are also Mopan Maya. And there's also Garifuna people, like the man in the photo on the right. And Garifuna people are from West Central African, Arawak, and Island Carib ancestry. So what's common among these different ethnic groups is a long-standing connection to the land and knowledge of wildlife and its sign, as many of them are subsistence hunters. So what we asked them was, we essentially had the study area gridded out, and we were asking within certain grid cells how often these people visited in the last year, if they'd seen any tracks of jaguar in that last year. And also we inquired about the 6 main large-bodied prey species over the past year. So there were 12 corridors in total that are listed here, and each corridor was broken into grid cells. And so these sampling unit sizes reflected the area over which human subjects were expected to have knowledge about wildlife. So they walked a mean of about 5 kilometers per day. So the grid cell was set at 5 by 5 or 25 square kilometers. And also the size was based on the estimated mean home range size of females. So we did 4 to 6 interviews in 60% of these grid cells and 1 to 2 in the remaining. We didn't need to get 4 to 6 in all of them. This setup was to maximize our efficiency while also not sacrificing the precision of our estimates in the model. So these are some fun photos here. These are the prey species we inquired about. So from the upper left going clockwise, we have the white-lipped peccary, the agouti, the paca, the armadillo, white-tailed deer, red brocket deer, and the collared peccary. And yeah, so interview data are really, they're relatively easy to collect, and they don't require equipment, so they're free. But they do introduce sampling heterogeneity over space and time. So, we had data collected in 12 corridors over 21 field seasons in 6 years and 6 countries. And within the same corridor, there were different survey teams for the larger ones. So you really need to account for that in any type of statistical modeling exercise. As well, interview data are prone to false positives. So people can say a jaguar is there when they are not, and false detections will bias estimates high. And so that is something you really need to account for, especially when working with a threatened species such as jaguar. Don't be alarmed by this slide. It's about as technical as we get today. So the model that we used here, for those of you who do modeling, it was a false positive occupancy model. So each of those grid cells was treated as a site. Each interview was treated as a replicate survey of that site. And stepping away from the math for a second, in an occupancy model, there are 2 processes happening. One is the species there or not? And then if the species is there, what are the chances that we detect it? So there's the state process, the whether or not the species is there, and then our observation process of that state process. So with this model, so there's 2 possibilities really, well, 4. So the species is there, represented by that psi, and this is for any given sampling unit. So the species could be there, and you either detect it through your interviews or you do not detect it. The alternative is that the species is not there, but you somehow falsely detect it in your interviews, or you correctly reject the fact that the species is not there. So in this big mathematical model, this formula is multiplied across all sites and interviews. You get a log likelihood, you get an estimation of all of these parameters, so you can have your probability of true positive, of a false positive, and your probability of whether the species is there. So for that true detection probability, we modeled that as a function of effort. So how many days of the year a certain person had spent in that unit. So the longer a person, the more days a person spends outside in a grid cell, we figured, well, they're more likely to detect a jaguar sign. And then we modeled that false detection probability as a function of the number of interviews. So that may seem counterintuitive, but we did think that the more people we interviewed, the higher that probability would be, because you have more chances of getting that false positive. So we also modeled that probability of whether the jaguar was there to begin with. So that's state process. And we had a number of covariates. We had percent agriculture, percent canopy cover, distance to settlement, elevation, distance to strictly protected area, and prey richness. And so in total, we collected about 4,000 interviews across 45,000 square kilometers in 6 years and 6 countries. And we were very, very pleased with ourselves. This was at the completion of the Southern Belize corridor. A lot of work went into this, and we were pretty stoked. So this is how the detection probability came out. Again, it's that observation process showing that it is important to account for detection. So when we held effort constant, the number of days a person had spent outside in the last year, we did see that detection probability varying by corridor, which is along the x-axis, by field season, and by year. But we didn't see a trend in years such that detection may have gone down over time. So this was considered more a nuisance parameter, like we're not so interested in this, but we did need to account for it in the main model. When it comes to jaguar habitat use, it was greatest with greater forest cover, when you get further away from settlements, when you have greater prey species richness, when there's less agriculture, when you're getting closer to other strictly protected areas, and at lower elevation. And the biggest drivers were percent forest cover and percent agriculture and pasture. So false positives were low and increased slightly with number of interviews. So around 5.5% with less than 4 interviews in a grid cell, and then about nearly 8% when you had greater than or equal to 4. Now you may think, okay, what's the big deal? This is such a low probability of false positives. Like surely it didn't affect model results that much. Well, here's our output. So for those of you who know GIS, this was all done in a GIS framework. This is the probability of jaguar habitat use in the model that accounted for false positives, right? When we don't do it, look at how much higher those estimates are. So things go from what is closer to reality, and I'll tell you why later. When you don't account for those false positive, things just look a lot rosier. And failing to account for false positives, biased predicted habitat use high by 2 times. And so again, when you're dealing with a threatened species, you can't really afford to be making those types of modeling errors or oversights. There were particularly large discrepancies in corridors 4 and 10. So the differences there were, they were biased high by 3 to 4 times. So again, important to consider that. So a genetic study that came out just before we put out this paper revealed that genetic subdivision was most pronounced between Guatemala and Honduras. So that's really looking at corridors 4, 5, and again, this is with false positives, and that's without accounting for them. So corridor 4 looks pretty darn good for jaguar when you're not employing the right model. So again, our observed genetic structure better reflected habitat use by jaguars using the false positive model than the one that ignored it. So take-home points here are that you can get reliable predictions in spite of data complexity from interviews with local residents, and that they do represent an important yet underutilized source of data on species. presence. And please explore false positives. Just writing down my time here. Okay. So question 2 was how the knowledge of local trackers can be utilized to inform multi-species occurrence and guide anti-poaching efforts. This paper is in Animal Conservation if you want to check out the nitty-gritty of the statistics work, because again, this work is all quite statistics heavy. Where we're going today is Hwange, Luana, and Mavinga National Parks in the dark gray in the left figure. And this is the largest contiguous national park complex in any one country in Africa. And it happens to be in Angola. And it's also within this transfrontier conservation area called Kaza in the dark black outline on the right figure. And it's the largest transfrontier conservation area in the world. It's the size of Spain. And it's a stronghold for lions, leopards, cheetah, buffalo, wild dog, and elephant. So a really, really incredible ecosystem. So in this area, there are San people. So these are indigenous hunter-gatherer groups that are the First Nations of Southern Africa, and their territories span multiple countries across Southern Africa. Their tracking abilities are considered legendary. And when Bushmen track reading abilities have been tested to Western scientific standards, they've proven remarkably accurate. And so I figured that in employing this type of method, what an opportunity to unify the advantages of traditional tracking skills with modern quantitative methods to inform conservation. So backing up a second, Angola does have a troubled past. So there was an Angolan civil war that led to the death of hundreds of thousands of Angolans, truly a traumatic time for Angola's people. And about 1/3 of the population was displaced. And what happens in times of war are that people become increasingly reliant on natural resources such as fuel wood and wildlife to sustain their livelihoods, and may seek refuge in protected areas for food and shelter. So this unfortunately is not great for wildlife. So wildlife is believed to have been slaughtered in mass during the war. And so households still employ bushmeat hunting, and there are elephant poachers still within those protected areas. Just in general, households do depend a lot on hunting wildlife and fishing within the protected area for personal consumption and income. And there's also livestock grazing, firewood collection. And yeah, there are small villages throughout both parks, particularly along rivers. And that's important in a point I'll discuss later. And this is one of our field staff members, and he's displaying a wire snare and a gin trap, both of which are used to ensnare wildlife. So the methodology here, basically there was a need to assess the wildlife community, what species are there, and spatially where are they? And so the choice was vehicle-based spoor transects. The word spoor is a bit weird if you've never heard it. It just means animal sign or track. So these transects are considered an efficient, low-cost method to detect multiple species across broad spatial extents. They're considered to be quick. They arguably require less effort compared to camera traps, but you do need suitable substrate. So you need like a sandy type substrate, and you do need sufficiently skilled trackers. So enter the San Bushman people. Here we have, this is the grid, the sampling grid. And the grid size here was much bigger than in the jaguar study. Pardon me. The grid size was 225 square kilometers, so much bigger. And this was the mean home range size of lion, which was the focal species of this survey. And also this was such a large area. The goal was just to provide information on species distribution at a scale relevant to park managers. And field work, I was not on the ground for this project, but I know that things were dangerous, that not all sites could be surveyed because some areas had uncleared landmines and they were otherwise inaccessible. So the goal was to get 15 kilometers of transect in each cell, And every 500 meters, there would be a summary of what species had been recorded on that segment. So again, we've got that 15-kilometer big transect with 500-meter
Apologies.
segments.
Oh, Lisanne, you froze there for a little bit.
Oh no.
So
Okay.
we lost you at the I was not there.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I did not know you lost me. So that's never happened before, actually, with me. Sorry. I will try again. So basically, yeah, the field teams did come up against some challenges. So not all of those sites could be surveyed because there were uncleared landmines. So yeah, it was just a tricky situation. So they were only able to access areas that had that were safe to travel on. I hope I'm not breaking up anymore. So here we have the goal was to collect data within each cell along a 15-kilometer transect, and then species detections recorded every 500 meters. So yeah, again, there was a 15-kilometer transect, but broken up into those 500-meter segments. For each segment, there was kind of a 0 or 1 as to whether each species had been detected. So these were all of the large-bodied mammals that were detected with the spoor transects using the Bushman trackers. And so going here, I'll use my other screen. We have leopard, we have spotted hyena, wild dog, cheetah, lion, and then here we have sable, rowan, elephant, buffalo, kudu, zebra, sable, and giraffe. Now, again, getting back to the statistics here, animals move linearly. If you see an animal once, you are likely to see it again in the next segment. And so that is an important kind of statistical anomaly you need to account for, because if you don't account for that Markovian dependence, which is what it's called when you're more likely to see something on the next in the next time step, it can lead to just bias in your occupancy estimates. So again, in separating that observation process from the state process, you need to get your detection probability right. Also, I wanted to do a community occupancy model. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially, again, just that occupancy model. You've got your detection process and your state process, but a community occupancy model lets you do it for multiple species in one framework. So you can estimate community level and species level effects. And it hadn't been extended to this data class. And so I wanted to do that. So big words here, I employed a hierarchical community-based occupancy model. Again, you can analyze data for multiple species in a single model, and it incorporates that correlated detection. And we do have those two scales. We have the greater grid cell, which is the level at which we were estimating species habitat use. But again, the spatial dependence is occurring on those smaller segments, and that's what was important to account for. So in terms of the state process, are animals there or not? We predicted that there would be more species, greater probability of use with more vegetation, with more rain, which means more productive vegetation, with proximity to water, and as well when you get further away from human settlements, when you get closer to other protected areas, and when you have less human sign. So there was widespread presence of people in the complex. So there were human sign in 90% of the units and livestock sign in 80%. And bushmeat was the most pervasive threat. There we documented the poaching of 19 mammals and 1 reptile species. So again, here are those 13 species, and the numbers here represent the percentage of cells where the species were found. So leopard, sable, and rowan. So we have leopard, sable, and rowan have the highest, they were detected in the highest percentage of surveyed cells, over 40%. And then you have the zebra and kudu, which were detected in far less. And they're presumed rare due to bushmeat poaching. So we did kind of have to kick out those 2 species. Granted, the model does allow for the estimation of parameters for those 2 species, but they get drawn towards the mean because they're so data sparse. And we thought that's not really that useful, so we'll just toss them. And looking here at the results, the orange covariates are the anthropogenic, so the human-related covariates, and the green ones are the ecological ones. The covariates with the credible interval overlapping 0 means not that informative. If those credible intervals are moving away from 0, that means informative. So in this system, the anthropogenic covariates had just a lot more explanatory value. And yeah, so with those credible intervals that do not overlap 0, meaning quite a strong effect. And the more traditional ecological covariates just didn't have much of an effect at all. So we had much stronger slopes for the anthropogenic covariates on top. So again, we had greater occupancy probability when you get close to an adjacent protected area, when you have less human sign, and when you're getting further away from human settlement. And with the ecological covariates on the bottom, you're just not seeing much of an effect at all. And the distance to water one was surprising. I was thinking there are water dependent ungulates such as elephant and buffalo. Certainly distance to water should be important. But then we also thought, wait a second, human settlements are also along rivers. So that could also be having an effect on where the wildlife are, kind of a competition for resources. And then this is getting a little crazy looking at the species level effects. I'm not going to tear apart this figure too much, but basically the point being is that when you see the anthropogenic covariates along the top, you're seeing a lot more credible intervals, not overlapping 0, meaning important, and things just get kind of messy with those ecological covariates on the bottom. So again, species level support, also suggesting anthropogenic covariates are most important in this system. So this is the output here, again, using GIS. Species richness ranged from 0 to 10.45 across grid cells. And it showed a clear decline where human impact was greatest. So, the light yellow, that's where we're really not seeing any species. And that happens to be where we have the most settlements. Whereas, in that southeastern area, which also happens to be near other protected areas, we're seeing more wildlife and less people. Silver linings for this area. So the Angolan Ministry of Environment is committed to tackling poaching, and with the results from this study and using the knowledge of the Bushman trackers, there has been an identification of 2 intensive protection zones, each about 1,000 square kilometers, and both in the southeast of this park complex. And also 22 jobs, as of the last status report, have been created to protect wildlife and sustain local people. So again, tricky area, but it does seem that with the right protection, wildlife can continue to exist and thrive. So take-home points here. Skilled trackers can serve as a high-quality data source for use in a community occupancy model that provides unbiased estimates of species richness. And, the cessation of war, so the Angolan Civil War ended, long ago relatively, but, it is inadequate to counter wildlife declines if there are still human impacts and still enforcement challenges. But with the assistance of conservation partners, it does seem that things are moving in a positive direction and that wildlife recovery is possible. So, final question here. Can a community guardian program successfully deter livestock depredations by lions? And what factors are associated with short and long-term success? So lions are vulnerable on the red list, and this one is seen with a cow, bad lion, and there are anywhere between 23,000 and 39,000 mature individuals remaining. So where we're going is Hwange National Park in Zimbabwe, home of the famous Cecil the lion. And again, you may notice that Hwange is in the same conservation landscape as Mavinga and Luenge Luana. So it's all within the same complex with lots of charismatic megafauna. So conflict between large carnivores and people, largely involving livestock depredation, is a global issue. So I did this literature search of nearly 200 peer-reviewed journal articles, and I found that it affects 37 species across 6 continents. And what happens is that in response to livestock loss, people will kill lions. They'll poison them, kill them directly, and then lions will depredate again, and then it's this perpetual cycle of conflict. So there are numerous approaches to reduce human-wildlife conflict. This could be an entire lecture in itself, but briefly, there are lethal means through targeted removal of problem individuals or through hunting. There's non-lethal methods such as fencing. So this is the construction of a livestock corral in Chilocho, Zimbabwe. And this was actually one of the better ones that I saw, just because there was so much fuel wood available. Also, you can use visual, auditory, and chemical deterrents, such as flashing lights, loud noises. You can also produce pain, so pepper spray, rubber bullets. You just want to ensure that the stimulus is noxious enough to deter unwanted behaviors. So what the people around affiliated with the Hwange Lion Project thought was, what if we use fear as the stimulus? What if we scare lions so bad that they don't depredate livestock? So enter the Hwange Longshields Community Guardians Program. So in this area, most people are Ndebele. They speak a mix of Ndebele and Nambia and other regional African languages. Traditionally, 19th century Ndebele people would have hunted and killed lions as the Maasai do today, though these practices have stopped with the advent of the protected areas system in Zimbabwe. So people, to keep lions away, will light fires, they'll bang pots and pans. But just for a more targeted approach, people at Wild Crew at Oxford University spearheaded a program that hires local people who have skills in wildlife tracking to monitor lion movements and warn people when they come close. And an added benefit is that at least one lion from each pride has a GPS collar and is live tracked. So text messages are sent to the guardians when the lions are close, and then they are chased on foot. And the guardians use these plastic horns called vuvuzelas to keep lions at bay. And the goal is for the lions to recognize community lands as high risk and to shift their space use to include more of the park, of the national park. So in general, this was a quick figure I came up with. The number of depredation events, so the number of livestock losses, has decreased in the community areas since the program began. So that's really great. And also the number of lions being killed has decreased through a multitude of means. So this is all really great. But what I was interested in is what factors are associated with immediate chase success. By immediate chase success, I mean a lion being pushed out of where it is not supposed to be by 7 a.m. of the next day. And what factors are associated with long-term behavioral changes by individual lions. So that was my question, again, using statistical analyses to do so. And we used a GPS database to monitor lion movements in response to chases. There were 109 lions collared, but the ones meeting the criteria, there were 15. They were from unique prides and coalitions, and they had part of their home ranges in community lands. And here's a map of the study area. So the hatched area is the community lands, and that is where lions are not supposed to be at all. And the light green is the forestry areas, which is a protected area, but where we really wanted the lions to be was in the national park. But we just needed to get lions out of that hatched area for a chase to be successful. So the methods here, chase success was a more traditional analysis. I used a mixed effects logistic regression to analyze what factors were associated with a successful chase. The more interesting method was that like long-term behavior. So with entering community lands and lions depredating livestock, I used a recurrent event survival model. So for those of you who have done wildlife statistical stuff, a survival model is generally, does an animal live or die? And then what factors increase that risk of death? With a recurrent event approach, you can essentially have an animal, quote unquote, die multiple times. In this case, it's the lion entering community lands again and again and again, and you can analyze what factors are associated with that. We tested a number of different covariates here for both of those analyses. So if you're getting lions early, if you're getting them early in their depredation history, will there be a more positive outcome? To the contrary, if they've killed a ton of livestock, is that going to make success more challenging? If a lion had been chased on the previous entry, is that effective in reducing behaviors? The one that I personally think is most interesting, the social resistance one, has there been the loss of a pride male in the last 6 months? So this causes social upheaval, and I'll get into that. When you lose a pride male through trophy hunting or problem animal control, it just causes a cascade of effects. And also things like temperature. Um, is it harder to chase a lion when it's hot outside? So first, most of the chases were successful and some were not, and they were less successful over time. So after chase number 10, success was about 30% as opposed to 60% when the chases started. Basically, the less distance you have to chase a lion, the better. If you're only needing to chase it 200 meters as opposed to 25 kilometers, the odds are in your favor for those shorter distances. Also, it's literally herding cats here. If you're chasing one or two, you'll have greater success than when you're having to chase a pride of 9 or 10 lions. And then again, pride and stability was the one that I thought was really, really interesting. Basically, when the pride is unstable, you're going to have less success. And that's because when you remove a pride male, there's competition for pride ownership, and these subordinate individuals, like young males, could get pushed into community lands where they're unlikely to leave. So that was a really interesting one. And again, with season, that was interesting. Basically, in this ecosystem, wild prey very reliably congregate around water holes in the dry season. So if you're going to chase a lion away from livestock, they're like, that's fine. I'll just go after the wild prey because they're around water holes. Whereas in the wet season, hunting wild prey is more difficult. So chasing them away from livestock will not be as successful. And as for those long-term behaviors, adult females, subadult males were more likely to enter the exclusion zone, the no-go zone. And that makes sense because adult males, they're established, they have territories, they're less likely to make risky decisions. However, there's room for this program to improve. So only 10% of entries to the no-go zone were followed by a chase in the next 48 hours. And half of those occurred at night. So they're not getting chased that often, and a lot of these problem events are happening at night when it's really unsafe to chase lions. So nearly at the end here, a few more slides left. So when it comes to the next livestock depredation, first of all, subadults are more likely to do so in the dashed line there. But also, what is the percentage of depredations that's followed by a chase? So when lions are chased 40% of the time after depredating livestock in green, you're less likely to see that lion depredate again. But if you're in red, just never chasing them after depredation, they are definitely going to depredate again. They're definitely going to depredate again. And then also, this is that concept of the problem animal. If the animal has cumulatively killed lots of animals, it is very likely that it will depredate again, as opposed to having only killed one. So take-home points here. Yeah, this program is Zimbabwean run, and it boosts the economy, it builds capacity, there's a sense of ownership in wildlife management, and it employs local residents and promotes tolerance of large carnivores. So, those are really big things that are important. And basically, to achieve greater program success, you do need consistent intervention. You do need to pay attention to that social context. So if a pride male has been lost, it may be really hard to push that subadult male out of community lands. So these things will help improve efficacy. And yeah, there are still livestock being lost to lions. So this isn't, a magic bullet, but it's certainly a step in the right direction, and it's empowering local people and using their innate skills in wildlife tracking to have positive conservation outcomes. So that is my 40-minute mark. So this was a whirlwind tour here of how harnessing the power of communities and their knowledge can guide conservation and management. I thank you for listening, and this is just my thank you slide, but I would like to thank Colin for inviting me here and to Coco for organizing this fabulous series, and I will open it up for any questions.
Thank you so much. I think the problem was actually on my end. I got booted off 3 times, but I heard you were there the whole time. So thank you.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Um, I was, what a fascinating presentation. And I'm wondering, like, what surprised you? As you reflect back on your thesis work and 3 really fascinating, very different kinds of projects, was there something that jumps out at you as like, wow, I never thought that would be so true?
Yeah, great question. I would say I didn't expect the data to be so darn good. Um, so again, people in my field tend to use, GPS collar data and camera trap data and, very precise measurements of things. And, working with data from communities is a bit amorphous. There are false positives and you don't have like a verified photo of that jaguar that they say they saw. But then throwing these data into a statistical model that accounts for those kinds of uncertainties, I was amazed at the relationships that we got with covariates and that the patterns that we modeled, people on the ground are like, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And seeing those results match up with the genetic work, it's like, whoa, it was pretty mind-blowing. So do not discount interviews and data that you're gathering from people, because it's really valuable.
Thank you for that. It actually sort of, a lot of the questions are about that source of data if you look at the Q&A. So
Oh, I haven't seen the Q&A.
yeah, so one of them is about false negatives. Another one is about like data from iNaturalist and the ways in which that could be used in these sorts of, efforts. I don't know if you want to talk about.
Yeah. So yeah, the false negatives was 100% included. So oh sorry, wait, sorry. False negatives meaning, oh yeah, right. So that means that the animal is there and you don't detect it, and that is at the heart of occupancy modeling. So with species as elusive as carnivores, of course, you're not necessarily going to see a lion or jaguar if it is indeed there. So like, yeah, an occupancy model accounts for false negatives, false positives, all of those contingencies. So great question. And yes, it's accounted for. Yeah, iNaturalist. Yeah, so that is becoming, so like citizen science data is becoming this new frontier, and I'm starting to see it a lot with eBird. The members in my lab do work with birds, and so there's a lot of eBird data out there, and eMammal and all. And so absolutely, that's becoming a big thing, though you do have to be aware of the nature. There is kind of like especially with eBird, there's sometimes biases near, big urban centers because that's where people are. These are opportunistic sightings. So you just need to be aware of the factors that could be driving those detections and how to account for that. But absolutely, citizen science is going to be a huge, huge thing, especially with cell phones and apps and all the data being collected. So absolutely.
I hope it can help you with your future wolf work, but you're right, effort is a hard thing to get around, differential effort.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you, one of the questions by Charles Cummings, do you suspect the known presence of ocelots in an area increase the false positive rate? In other words, a misidentification. And then likewise, do you suspect a certain survey participants may be more likely to give you false positives? For example, would a rancher be more likely to say there was a jaguar than a non-rancher?
This person works in the field, because those are really good questions and completely correct. So if in the interview protocol, we did use certain, we tried our best to determine, is this person knowledgeable to begin with? So we had certain photos of animals, and we would say, does this species occur here? Does this one? And there was one species that definitely did not occur. And if someone said, oh yeah, I've seen that, we wouldn't proceed with the interview. So when we were getting false positives, it wasn't because of a lack of knowledge. It was more because of possible just a genuine species misidentification. So with tracks of, for example, red-brocket deer or white-tailed deer, those are kind of hard to tell apart. Perhaps someone could confuse a juvenile jaguar with an ocelot. And so, yeah, absolutely, that types of species misidentification can happen. They also may not have the same sense of time that we do. So like the last year, they could be, as much as I tried to say, the last year, they could be talking about a detection from 5 years ago. So we do think that most of the false positives were likely through honest means, though there absolutely could have been more false positives among ranchers. One thing that I wish we had done at the start of this protocol was collect more information on people. So what is because we needed to ensure privacy, but I would have loved to know, are you, a rancher, and what are your thoughts on conservation, and see how that interacted with that false positive component, but we just didn't have it. But great point.
Yeah. So Ben Chu asked, how did you become aware of the false positive bias from interviews? Did you know it was going to be an issue before beginning the study, or was it something that the data looked suspicious?
Yeah, yeah, wow. These are really great questions that I've never gotten before. So I, I was suspicious, yes, because there were some, grids where it would be a 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then a 1. And it's like, so we ask 6 people and 5 of them say definitely no, and 1 is like yes. And so that threw up a red flag. But just more generally, it was because, with camera traps or more traditional methods, false positives are less likely. It just was a factor that we had to account for just because humans are not infallible. So it was the nature of the data, but also looking at it, I was like, there are a lot of single 1 detection histories, meaning 0, 0, 0, and then a 1 in these really poor corridor areas. And I suspected that they were not true ones, and the modeling said that they were unlikely to be true.
Mm. So you estimated, I think if I'm interpreting Lauren Litterman's sort of follow up on false positives, a 5 to 8% use for the false positive probability, and wondering if this is similar to other kinds of um, things in the literature, other studies.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
there a
So
pattern emerging?
yeah, so I know. Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I know that at the time of this publication, there were only a few others, because there's also false positive work and like auditory surveys for frogs, for instance, and that's a completely different thing. But in terms of interviews and false positives, I'm really not sure, but I would guess that it's about, just given our sample size, I'm guessing it has to be around what we're expecting. It also depends on how you're recruiting your participants. If you have less of a filter and you're accepting everyone, then maybe you'll get a higher percentage. But we did our best to recruit only those who really knew about wildlife. So I would hope our percentage was about typical, but I'm not too sure.
So Luke is asking a really interesting question about sort of how you engage with the community, like sort of building that trust in order to sort of start. So he writes, what were some strategies you used to effectively bring in, engage residents for the Jaguar connectivity project? How do you make that initial connection?
Right, right. So what's crazy, it was kind of like I was, in my mid 20s at the time of that work, and I wasn't given much guidance at all. So you just need to figure things out as you go. What we would do upon approaching any village was we would ask around and ask who the village head was. And sometimes that person wasn't home, and then it gets complicated. But we would sit with that person and explain our project. And I had a Belizean woman working with me who people knew, so that was nice. And it's just about explaining who you are, that the purpose of the project, and that we're not seeking to take away any of your ability to exist in this ecosystem. And then there were questions, and then we would ask, is it okay if we interview some members of your community, and who do you think would know most about wildlife. And so basically kind of putting them in the driver's seat and feeling like an important part of this process, because without these village heads, we wouldn't have had any idea who to talk to and where to go. So, we had a lot of villages to visit. So I wish I could have established deeper connections, but I think just showing that respect I mean, I almost never had someone turn me down. So I think it's just showing respect, openness, and honesty are important.
Thank you. We have a time for maybe two more questions. So um, a couple of them are related to the habituation study.
Mm,
And so maybe we can sort of combine them into one.
mhm,
One is
mhm.
do lion prides that are conditioned to avoid livestock prevent naive lions from entering the vicinity of humans? And the other one is, did you encounter any signs of habituation, or do you anticipate this being a problem in the future? In other words, you kind of mentioned that it doesn't work as well after time. So
Mhm,
do you see this as a strategy that has legs, or
mhm.
you've kind of shown that habituation's just too problematic?
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, great question. I've thought about this a lot. I think the program is great. Physically chasing lions away is immediately preventing livestock loss. It is keeping lions alive that would have been killed in problem animal control otherwise. Less livestock are being lost, less lions are being killed, so it's a win. There is habituation. Lions that have been chased again and again are like, I know that there is not an actual threat to my life right now, so I'm going to go after this cow. So it's not, again, the magic bullet. There needs to be strong livestock corrals built at night. Yeah, again, because the guardians can't chase at night anyway. So that needs, and there needs to be more consistent chasing as well. And as to whether lions that are conditioned to avoid livestock are teaching others to do the same, that is a great question. And whoa, I would love to study that, but we don't know yet. But really cool question.
Thank you. It does. So, well, great talk. A lot of people are commenting about great talk, really
Oh,
interesting
thank
work.
you.
I couldn't get to everybody's questions, so I just want to like encourage people to reach out to you through your website that we posted earlier, and
Please do.
sort of follow up with questions. She's given you access to her papers that can get you down into the details, the muck of you can
Mhm.
learn to track mathematical models if you explore her papers. So I wanted to sort of end by funding. If you could just talk a little bit about sort of what was key to making the work that you do really possible, both for jaguars in Central America, lions in Africa, and wolves in the Northwest.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the wolf work is funded through the state wildlife agency. And my work in big cats has been through, Oxford University's Wild Crew and through Panthera. And both I know rely on donations from private foundations and individual donors to thrive. And I published a paper recently that, you know, Western nations need to do more in supporting international biodiversity conservation. The amount that we donate elsewhere is paltry. So I would love to see more, international efforts in supporting conservation elsewhere. But yeah, it's largely privately funded stuff.
Well, thank you so much, and everybody, virtual clap. It's really a pleasure to have you, and we will stop the recording now.
Okay. Thank you all.